How's everybody doing? You guys get some ice cream at that last break, huh? Getting ready to finish strong? All right, next up, we've got Kurt Aubuchon, a local guy who's currently the Global Incident Manager at IBM. Also is no stranger to the podium. He has given talks at Secure World as well as at B-Sides, Missouri. And he also guest lectures from time to time at St. Louis University. I think you'll really enjoy this. So without further ado, Kurt Aubuchon.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? So thanks for that introduction. I'm not exactly the global incident manager at IBM. I'm one of them, which is still a pretty cool job. So I want to thank everyone for coming to ShowMeCon and to coming to my presentation. Thanks very much. Okay. Does anyone know, that's not me, by the way, does anyone know why I picked Dan Stevens? Did anyone else in this room see the movie The Guest other than me? Okay. Okay, very good. All right. Okay. My wife said that maybe people would think that was me before I cut my hair, and I don't think anyone would make that mistake. That is, in fact, the guy from Downton Abbey. Okay, so who am I? I've been in IT for about 15 years, about 10 of that in security. There's a little bit about me. There's my alphabet soup. I do work for IBM as an incident handler or incident manager. I do want to stress that I'm here representing myself and some research I've done on my own. So if I say anything particularly stupid, please don't feel the need to call my boss. I have spent a lot of my life in St. Louis. I live currently in Columbia, Missouri with my wife and our two little investigators. They're about so tall. They got their first forensic duplicators at Christmas, and the look on their face was just priceless. So that's it. And go Cardinals. Okay. So this presentation is going to be talking a little bit about doing a forensic examination where you've got a VMware environment. You got some sort of host machine and some sort of VMware guests. So right now, in my current job, I don't really do too much hands-on forensics, but when I did, and I was examining a virtual machine environment or some sort of VMware VM, I would, grab a copy of the VMDK. If I was feeling particularly optimistic about my technical skills that day, I'd get the VMM file. I'd take the VMDK, I'd slam it into, FTK or Incase or whatever, and I would look at that sort of just like it were a DED, right? Just like it was kind of in isolation, and I would kind of get sort of tunnel vision on the VMDK, right? That's probably a limited way, or maybe not the most, maybe not the most comprehensive way to do an investigation when you're looking at virtual machines. The VM, we like to think about the VM as being in isolation, right? But the VM is not really an island. The host and the guest have to talk to each other, right? Just logically, the host and the guest have to communicate. They have to share information. And as our good friend Dr. Locard would probably have predicted, that communication is going to leave some traces, right? You're going to have some artifacts of what the host and the guest are talking about. So in this presentation, I'll talk a little bit about that. Talk about some artifacts of guest applications that are left on the host. A little bit about cross-contamination of unallocated space, and some artifacts of drag and drop actions. By the way, if you have any questions as I go along, please go ahead and ask. And if I start to talk too fast or mumble, which I often do, kind of let me know, and I'll try to stop for a while. Okay. So a little bit of a disclaimer. So I've done, I've researched this to some extent, and I've tried to, simulate real-world scenarios. But you do want to try to duplicate my findings and verify these results before you're using this in a real investigation. Okay. So first of all, we'll talk about some artifacts that guest machines leave on the host. So VMware has a function called Unity Mode. How many people here are familiar with Unity Mode in VMware? Okay, a few, right? I was not really familiar with that before I started looking into this. So there's a little bit from the VMware website about Unity Mode. And what Unity Mode is pretty cool. It allows you to use an application that's on the guest and it appears kind of seamlessly on the host. So here's kind of an example. Here's a Windows 7 host with a Windows XP guest, and I've launched it in Unity mode, and you see you get this sort of second start menu, and you click on that. That's this part here. Oops, right. So there's your sort of second start menu. You click on that, and then you get the start menu from your guest, right there in the context of your host, and you can launch whatever application happens to be on the guest. So that's pretty cool. I never actually used it before, but it's a pretty neat function. So how does that work, right? The host has to know what's going on the guest in order to do that, right? So if you look in the directory where your VMDK file is, and here's my my test machine, right? Here's my VMware apps cache. That's what I cleverly named the VM that I was testing on. Right where that VMDK is, you'll see this folder called caches. You drill down into there, a couple subdirectories, and you look in this path here, caches, guest apps cache, app data. You'll see in here, there are these pairs of files with this very, very long name. I have no idea what the name means. I haven't figured that out yet. Some sort of hash value, I presume. So you have these very long names, and you'll have two files named the same, except for one will be called Aubuchon and one will be called AppInfo. So if you open up, say, AppInfo in your favorite text editor, you'll see this thing here, this path, right? So for example, I've got an XP VM, and this tells the host where WordPad is on the guest. In a fresh XP VM, you'll get 137 files, and they'll be in these pairs, right? These AppInfo, Aubuchon pair. So AppInfo tells you the path to the application on the guest, and the Aubuchon file, not surprisingly, is the icon, right? So they've pre-pinded some things here, but you strip away everything from there back, and you've got a PNG file. You save that off, right, and you get the icon for WordPad. So everything that's on the guest is, this is how the guest tells the host, hey, here's what I've got. So when you want to do Unity mode, that's how the host does it. Then in this path here, caches, guest apps cache, launch menu. There's this other file called launch menu metadata. And this is one long file that has, again, the path for everything on the guest. So this is sort of duplicates the information that's in the AppInfo and Aubuchon pairs of files. Okay, so that's all well and good, right? But what is why do we care about that? What does that mean for us as forensics people? By the way, is this another movie that I'm the only one in the room who's seen? Did anybody else see this movie? Okay, all right. So why do we care, right? Those two pairs of files, the AppInfo and Aubuchon, are created, and the launch menu metadata file is populated whether or not you ever use Unity mode, right? So you got a fresh install of a VM. You never use Unity mode. In fact, I had never heard of Unity mode when I first saw these files, right? So those files get populated no matter what. Whenever anything gets put into the start menu on the guest, you get these two pairs of files, and that gets added to that launch menu.metadata file. So you install a new application on the guest, and you let it create a start menu icon. You get those files. You just copy some, you copy some batch file into the start menu, or you put whatever you want in the start menu. It doesn't have to be an application install. It could be that you just put, in the startup menu or in the start menu, you could just put anything you want, and you get this information. If you install an application but tell it not to create the start menu icon, then you don't get these files, right? So it's purely a function of something being put into the start menu. Now, when you launch an application within the context of the guest, nothing happens. When you launch when you open up the guest console and launch an application, these files don't get altered, and as far as I know, they don't even get touched. But the first time you launch an application in Unity mode, then you get a second pair of app info and app icon files. So in my test, when I fired up WordPad in Unity mode from my host, I got 2 new files with 2 new names, app icon, app info, which were the same files as before. It's not clear to me why VMware has duplicates the files, but there you have it. So that's great for us, right? Because that tells us if someone ever fired something up in Unity mode, well, now you know. And again, the first time something's launched in Unity mode, it copies the icon into this path here, caches, link icons. So you'll see there's the icon to WordPad with the same name as that second pair of app info, app icon files. Okay. So this is really the best bit for us, right? When you remove an application from the guest, or when you clear that information out of the start menu on the guest, these files are left there, right? These files are there forever. I can't find anything that cleared these files. The information is cleared from launch menu.metadata, that big long file that kept information on every application, but the app info, app icon files stay there. So you've got a bad guy who's doing bad things on a VM and tries to clear his tracks by removing that application or removing things out of the start menu. Chances are they're not going to know that this is here. And so you might be left with some fairly good information about what happened on the guest, even after that application has been uninstalled. So that's all well and good for a Windows host and Windows guest. I didn't try every single possible combination of Windows and Linux and all the various Linux flavors. So it works about the same way with different combinations of hosts and guests, with a few wrinkles. So I tested this with a Windows 7 host and an Ubuntu guest. The default Ubuntu desktop is something called Unity, which is coincidental. It's not related to Unity mode in VMware. And so but the default Ubuntu desktop doesn't work with VMware Unity mode. So in that case, you don't actually get these files. But if you change your desktop to GNOME or something like that, then you do get all these files. So, there's some wrinkles, right? Some variations of hosts and guests do or don't create these files. Sometimes you have to manually change your desktop or so on. But by and large, this works. My testing works about the same way in various different scenarios. And there it is, on an Ubuntu guest, showing, I switched it to the GNOME desktop, and it shows there that I get all my app info, app icon files. I tried this with a Linux host and a Windows guest. In this scenario, VMware Tools wasn't installed by default, so you don't get those directory. So you have to install VMware Tools on the guest. By the way, I kind of skipped this over on a previous slide, but it's the VMware Tools utility on the guest that makes these, right? So when you're installing default installation of Windows XP on your guest, you'll see these caches pop up at the same time you see your guest installing VMware Tools, right? Which is usually like the last thing that the guest does. So that's pretty cool. Again, it gives you some insight into what's going on the guest. And again, those files, as far as I can tell, stay around forever. If you have an ESXi host and Windows guest, this does not seem to work. And that kind of makes sense, right? There really wouldn't be much of a reason to do Unity mode on an ESX host, right? So if you can figure out a way to make this work on an ESXi host, let me know. But I was not able to. All right. So another area that's kind of interesting with the discussion or with the communication between guests and hosts is unallocated space. So when you set up a VM or when you add drive space to a VM, so you're taking drive space from the host and you're assigning it to the guest, VMware wipes that space before giving it to the guest. So when you take your VMDK and you're examining that, in your forensic tool of choice, and you look at unallocated space, anything that was recently assigned from the host to the guest is going to be zeros, right? It's going to be wiped. And if you just kind of allow the VMDK to grow naturally, again, it appears to kind of, every time it adds a chunk to the VM, it wipes it first. But the reverse is not true. Now, you can shrink a VM, and there's a link talking about why you might do that and how to do it. If you shrink a VM, or shrink the VMDK, it doesn't, right? VMware does not wipe the guest unallocated space before it turns it back over to the host. So I'll show you how I tested this, and there's my test scenario there. Okay, so I spun up a VMware guest. So there's my XP guest, and I put a whole bunch of files on there with just a bunch of pound signs, right? So I gave myself several gigabytes of just pound signs on my guest. Then I deleted those files just with a normal plain old Windows delete. So I've got all these pound signs sitting in the unallocated space of my guest, right? Then I shrink the VMDK. And by the way, I was doing this on a external hard drive. So I had an external USB drive that I had wiped beforehand. So the only thing on this drive was whatever VMware put there. So I fill up my VMDK, fill up my guest with pound signs or hash marks. Then I delete them so they're all sitting around in unallocated space. Then I shrink my VM. And then I look at unallocated space on my host hard drive, right? So this is, I took the host hard drive, examined it in FTK Imager, looked at unallocated space, and there's all my pound signs. Okay, so VMware, before giving the space back to the host, does not wipe it. Okay, so it kind of leaves a mess. So you might shrink your VM as part of normal maintenance. You might move your VM from one place to another and then shrink it. You might shrink it because you think you're being anti-forensic. But this kind of cross-contamination of unallocated space, could give a misleading impression of activities on the host, right? You might be, looking at a host machine that's got one or more VMs on it, and you find some weird thing in unallocated space, and you're like, how could that be an unallocated space when the application that generates that artifact isn't on the host? Well, it's possible that it was on a guest at some point, and then someone shrunk the guest, and the guest just dumped all that crap on the host. All right. And then last but not least, if artifacts of file drag and drop actions. So one way to get a file from the host to the guest is you just do a drag and drop, right? Or you just copy and paste the file, from the guest right into the host, or from the host right into the guest console. So when you do this in VMware, VMware creates a staging directory on the guest. So on a Windows guest, there's the path. It's in the temp path file directory called VMware D&D, which I presume means VMware drag and drop, right? And you can see the code that does this. VMware gives that away on GitHub, so there's the path to that. So there's my test scenario. So when I'm copying the files over, it creates a randomly named subdirectory under VMware D&D. So let's say I've got my a file on my host, and I'm going to copy it straight to the desktop on my guest. So the permanent file, the one that winds up on the desktop, has the create date of the copy action, which is what you would expect, right? When you copy a file, the new file has the create date at the time of the copy action. But there's a temporary file that gets left in VMware D&D that has that retains the create date of the file on the host. So that's kind of cool. So here's testing that. I got an ebook copy of Moby Dick. Here it is on my host machine. Note the create date there. Is that November 3rd, 2012 at 1:41 a.m. UTC. And that, if that were legible, you'd see what I meant. There it is on the desktop of my guest after the drag and drop. And I did this, on November 11th at 3 a.m. UTC. That's when I did my copy and paste, and so the resulting file on the desktop has that timestamp as the create date, which you would expect. But then in the VMware D&D directory on the guest, you see the create date is the same as the create date on the host. That's kind of weird, right? Kind of strange that you're copying it to this supposedly isolated environment, but it knows what the create date was on the host, right? So that file persists until you bounce your VM. When you bounce the VM, it goes away. But lots of times in a production environment, you might not bounce a VM for a long time, right? You might just suspend it, or you might just leave it up and running for a while. So that can shed some light on what's going on in your host. If your guest is a Linux machine, the staging directory doesn't create a full copy of the file. It just creates a symbolic link. And the create time of that is the same as the create time of the copy. So it's not as helpful. In fact, it's not very helpful at all as it is when you have a Windows guest. But it's kind of cool because someone could copy something to your guest, delete it, not realizing that a copy of it is still sitting around in the VMware D&D directory, and then you can go dig it out of there, right, and then see what this person thought they were deleting. Okay. And you can do the reverse, right? You can drag and drop from the guest to the host. There's the path on Windows 7 on the host path for where the D&D directory is. And just kind of same way as in the reverse, the staging file on the host has the same create date as the file on the guest. And VMware never cleans that up, right? As far as I can tell, when you do a drag and drop from the guest up to the host, that staging file there stays there forever. VMware never cleans that up. So again, if someone is doing something that they maybe shouldn't be doing on their guest, copy it up to the host, delete it, and then not realize that this big trace is still sitting around. Okay. That took a lot less time than when I was practicing this. So, all right. So right now, you guys know as much as I know about this topic, but if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Yes? I don't know. The answer is no. I have not looked into that. Usually, probably most people when they delete the guest, they just highlight the VMDK or highlight the directory and hit delete, right? If you delete it through VMware, I don't know what happens. That's a great question. I don't know. Oh, yes, sir. So I was limited in how much I could test because I don't run an ESXi server at home and they don't let me play with it at work. So the main thing I tested was whether or not I could get that guest apps cache on an ESX host, and I couldn't figure out a way to make that work. The turning over the unallocated space, I had difficulty looking at the ESX host in my forensic tool, so I think that would work on an ESX host, but I wasn't able to confirm it. So. Other questions? I really intended this to take like 40 minutes. So. No one? No one? We'd like to talk about the Cardinals? Okay. All right. So please feel free to contact me. There's my contact information. Would love to hear from you. And if you find any behavior that is kind of related to this, please let me know, and would love to compare notes with you. So thanks very much.